So let's think about the process of deinstitutionalisation here in England. The story begins in 1954, and we had then a maximum number of psychiatric beds. It was about 140,000 for a population of maybe 50 million. And what happened then is that the numbers went down, down, down to now about 40,000 beds. So we've closed about 3/4 of all our psychiatric beds over about 40 years. What happened in practice is that we closed nearly all of the long stay beds and we kept nearly all of the acute beds. So it's not that we closed hospital beds, it's that we closed long stay beds in long stay hospitals, and then we kept the acute beds in other types of hospital more recently. So why did we want to close these large hospitals? Mainly because they were miserable places to work or to be treated. We had originally in England the biggest ever programme of building municipal or state buildings. And in fact we built 140 large asylums across England. Very similar, very big central buildings and wards around in a radiating pattern. Built very quickly, mostly between about 1880 and 1900, and usually on the edge of a city, often on the top of a hill. And at the time, this was a revolutionary idea, which is to invest in these buildings, to follow the ideas of the mental hygiene movement, is that you could treat, or at least you could contain people, and you should treat people in a humane way. And originally most of these hospitals were intended for about 1,000 people. So what happened is that these fine ideas were badly damaged, usually within the first 10 or 20 years, because the hospital did not contain 1,000 but contained 2,000 people. So the idea of the active treatment, of rehabilitation, of people working in laundries, on farms, in sewing shops, things like this, were very badly harmed because of the pressure of numbers. So from an early stage, certainly by about 1900, 1920, these were not seen to be therapeutic centres, but warehouses where people were kept outside the mainstream of society. So the idea that you would receive treatment and then return to the mainstream society rapidly vanished. So what happened by the middle of the 20th century is we had these 140,000 people. Many had been in hospital 20, 30, 40 or longer years.
Originally in the UK, the drive was for closing down old-style mental hospitals, the asylums. What drove that process was the recognition that the experience of people in these long-term institutions were very negative. They were open to abuse. People had been incarcerated in these institutions for a much longer period of time than the clinical conditions warranted.
Conditions are often miserable. You'd have sometimes 60, 80, 100 people in a ward, beds next to each other, no room for any personalised belongings, everything regimented, meal times, activity times and so on. So these were a form of institutionalised care for people with mental illness. And the idea that you would recover by that stage had disappeared. You had a whole set of language about the chronic patient, the institutionalised patient, with no expectation that their life in the future would be any different or any better.
One of the interesting things that happened was that when the nursing staff in the hospital heard about the closure, they of course were very worried because their jobs were at risk. The problem was that very few of the nurses wanted to leave. They were much more institutionalised than the patients in a way. So when it came to fill the nursing places in the new community homes, only half the places were filled. The other half had no psychiatric qualifications. Who were they? They were university graduates who couldn't find a job, and they were tempted by the salary in these sheltered homes to come and work there. I think it was an enormous advantage for two reasons. First of all, these were young men and women, highly intelligent. They were graduates from the university. They knew very little about mental illness, but they had very humane attitudes. They wanted to help. And they were not institutionalized in the way that the nursing staff were. So they actually created a much better atmosphere in the homes than if all the staff had been nurses.
Most people who were using the hospital did not like the hospital, and the conditions in the hospital were pretty appalling. The emphasis was on controlling people, very restrictive care, very coercive care for individuals coming in there. It is not surprising that many patients did not want to come into hospital because the conditions in the hospital were dire. They were very negative.
During the reign of mental health hospitals, there were 140 asylums in the United Kingdom. However, after deinstitutionalization, the process of moving patients from psychiatric institutions to the community, there are now less than 12. This has led doctors, along with the community, to develop modern care. There is evidence these people were kept apart from society as a way of containment. Both political parties were interested in closing down these hospitals at the time, either for financial reasons or human rights interests.
So among the reasons for why these asylums were closed is that they were simply producing very bad outcomes and experience for the people who were incarcerated there. Second, they're also miserable places to work for staff. There's a great deal of pessimism. There was routines for everything. These can't have been satisfying places for staff to work. Thirdly, we then began to discover, after the Second World War, new types of treatment and new types of service that could be replacing these large asylums.
Asylum-based care was increasingly becoming associated with scandals in these institutions. People being abused, the negative experiences of many people living there, and how the recognition that people who were being looked after in the asylums could be looked after more effectively elsewhere. Models of alternative care were emerging. And very importantly, the human rights issues around confining somebody into an institution and keeping that individual there, their rights as citizens were being denied.
Also, there was also the influence then of ideas about human rights, that we should be treating people in any healthcare setting with dignity, with respect. And then the next element that came through was evidence-based medicine, so that we should be actually testing treatments to see if they work or not. If they don't work, they should be stopped. If they do work, we should invest in it. And there was no evidence that these asylums did anything effective apart from contain the problem, if you like. So certainly by the 1970s, 1980s, ideas had changed, and it became common in Western countries, in the high-income countries, to begin to reduce the numbers of beds in the large-scale asylums.
There has been a substantial reduction in the number of psychiatric beds in this country over the last 25 years. But these institutions, psychiatric hospitals in smaller scale, still survive, and they do actually continue to function as providing institutional care.
It was believed by the optimists that once you moved the patients into good conditions in the community, they would not need to be rehospitalized. But that proved to be untrue. And at any one time in our study over the 13 years, 1 in 10 patients was back in a psychiatric hospital. Life in the community wasn't as easy as it might be imagined. And there were breakdowns. There were people who relapsed in the community. So it was imperative at that stage to keep the acute psychiatric wards open.
Professor Julian Leff led a group of 70 researchers along with Professor Graham Thornicroft in the study Therapy for Acute Psychiatric Services. TAPS went on for 13 years evaluating if community-based care was as good as or better than hospital-based care.
What we developed was a model of psychiatric care that emphasized the need for looking after everybody at their own homes. The resources we had available to support that notion were the staff members. We had staff in the hospital, doctors, nurses, psychologists, social workers, healthcare assistants, people who had worked together as a team in a particular ward in the hospital, a section of the hospital. we were the resources necessary to provide the new service. So what we said was, we are leaving the hospital. We also found that by looking after people at home, treating people at home, we were able to deal with their mental health crisis, their acute manifestations of mental illness, much more quickly and effectively than it would have been the case if they had gone to hospital.
I went to a large hospital. It had been there for 100 years. It had about 1,000 patients, and I interviewed 100 patients, and the hospital then closed. I then went back a year after they left hospital to talk to the same people, and I interviewed them the same way. And essentially I was saying, I want to compare your experience in hospital and your experience in the community. So in some respects, the people hadn't changed very much. Their symptoms were pretty much the same. The things they could do, shopping, cooking, cleaning, were not very much changed. But when you assess the needs, then the needs were much more often met by the community care facilities. When we assessed quality of life, it was better. And we said to the patients who were then living in the community, well, service users, what do you prefer, living in the community or living in hospital? And 76% said, we like it in the community better. We then said, what would you recommend to other people still in a large hospital? And 85% said they would recommend moving out into the community. Now why? Because you've got more autonomy, more choice, more control. You've probably got your own bedroom, or perhaps you've got 2 people in a bedroom, not 20. You've probably got your own locker or your own area where you can keep your things. You can decide if you have visitors. You can go out to the shops. You can decide if you're going to watch television what. You're not given the standard, program on the ward for that day. So basically it's about choice, about autonomy, about agency. And those are the issues that seem to matter. Now, when hospital closure began, some people said, this will be a terrible mistake. There will be neglect. Some people will be homeless. There will be terrible things happening. Patients will be untreated. They'll become violent. We'll see murders and so on. This will be a disastrous mistake. One must keep these large hospitals to keep the whole problem safe and contained. So we looked at that directly. We measured people who became homeless after leaving hospital. We measured any forensic or criminal events, including serious assaults or homicides over that period. And the critics were wrong.
And almost overnight, we were able to set ourselves up outside of the community, and we were able to then provide people with help and support at home through what we called a home treatment service.
Once they got out into the community, into these sheltered housing, it was very much more free in terms of we actually measured the number of rules and regulations, which was 27 in the hospital ward and 11 in the community. And the patients responded very well to that increase in freedom, and that's the answer they gave when we asked them, what is it that makes you feel you want to stay in the home? And they would say, we feel much freer.
Following the new sense of freedom, a range of alternative treatments began to spread, such as acute day centers and London-based facility Cooltan Arts, both of which support mental distress.
There's now a huge variety of ways of looking after mentally ill people in the community without taking them into a hospital. For example, there's what's known as the acute day hospital. Now, a day hospital is where the patients go in for during the day, and then when the evening comes, they go home to their family if they've got a family. And that is works very well as long as the family is supported by professionals. You can't expect the family to look after quite ill, mentally ill people without some supervision and help.
I currently work in an acute inpatient ward, so essentially it's an 18-bedded ward where patients stay kind of full time. What we do is kind of helping that people in that kind of crisis kind of stage. What we probably tend to do when people start to come out of that crisis stage is then we look at, okay, this person's going to need to go into the community soon. Now, are they going to do that on their own, or are there steps that we can start to put into place that's going to help reskill them, or that's going to send them to somewhere that is going to help them do that and give them that extra support? So, for example, I think occupational therapists, especially at the moment, is going to help them with those practical skills. So there will be cooking groups on the ward, walking groups, gardening groups, that although it may not be specific skills that people may use in the community, it's all kind of building up the social elements of that. It's building up that structure, that motivation, which a lot of people can lose after being in hospital for such a long time.
The other is something quite different, and that is it's called a house in the community, or a home in the community. So this is an ordinary house that is used to look after patients with psychiatric illness. It can be quite severe, but it's much more on the lines of an ordinary domestic house. So the patients are expected to choose the menus, go out and buy the food. They're given money to buy the food, cook the food, prepare it, serve the food. In other words, do all the domestic things that we would do in our own homes. And even quite disturbed patients can settle down in these environments.
A lot of people that have got mental health distress have a lot of problems with their diet. They can have a lot of problems with their diet, and also where they live. Maybe they just have a microwave, or they have limited cooking abilities, and also they may be on low income. So we teach them how to shop locally source food on a budget, and also meet other people so they're less socially isolated.
Which is one of the benefits possibly of inpatients, is everybody is all together. They do become a little community. You see friendships blossom, and they do carry on into the community because you're meeting people that are having a similar experience to you, an experience that you possibly thought you were suffering with alone.
Mental health care cannot take place, cannot happen without the involvement of the community.
Having that weekly group to go to helps them, I think, not just with the social isolation, meeting new people in a gradual way, but it also teaches them new skills and gives them new abilities, which in turn raises their self-esteem.
A small proportion of people, a small number of people, we are sure, will require help with accommodation, because they might be homeless, they may not have any place to stay, they might have fallen out with their families, or the families themselves might be very important, very significant, making a significant contribution to the difficulties they're experiencing. So we need to find appropriate residential accommodation for these people, but it doesn't have to be a hospital.
Sometimes, for example, being helped to go back to live with their families. That isn't always straightforward. There may have been years of contact lost. The families may be very reluctant to take back somebody for stigmatizing reasons, or because the behavior is still not very acceptable to families. But it means having forms of support then to go and live with family, or in other families through supported care, or in other types of residential care. So you don't need hospital beds for that. They're actually being looked after with enough level of support rather than sitting in a hospital.
It's moving people on. It's reskilling people after being in hospital for a long time. And then finding somewhere that is going to be safe and appropriate for them to go.
The important thing is not to have them in a place which only patients go to. It has to be a mixture of patients with the ordinary community members in order for them to feel that they're in an ordinary environment, not in somewhere specialised because they're not well.
Some people are so unwell that they need acute psychiatric beds briefly to help them to recover from that crisis. And in no country is there any evidence that they can produce a comprehensive system of care only with community-based services. So we need a few beds. But those don't need to be in a psychiatric hospital. Indeed, often they are best mainstreamed as beds in a psychiatric ward in a general local hospital, so that there's actually no distinction between the physical and mental health care that's being introduced. Do we still need the large institutions? In most cases, no. That money is much more effectively spent to get better outcomes and better patient experience in the community.
I would also argue that we must seriously re-examine the current preoccupation within mental health practice around the idea of risk that dominates, for example, forensic psychiatry, where a great deal of our money is being spent, where a large number of people are being locked up, without very little prospect of them being released, and the proliferation of these forensic psychiatric institutions. I believe that is actually driven by this preoccupation with risk, especially to other people, as a consequence of their mental health difficulties. We must re-examine that. I think that particular analysis has been extremely unhelpful and has only resulted in this process of re-institutionalization gathering momentum.
If you're going to close down or reduce the size of a hospital, then you should do that slowly, but in fact set up community services first. And often that might take 3 years. So you open up community services, people sit in hospital, then those people go out to community services, and then you can reduce the size of the hospital. That's sometimes called transition funding. But many countries don't have that luxury, but that's the best way to do it.
The teams that we originally set up in Birmingham, for example, have been year on year underfunded, and there has been less and less money being spent on these teams. And the services that were developed at that time have not been sustained to the same degree as we thought would happen. And this has resulted in a new crisis in relation to community care.
The Conservative government has been cutting and cutting away at the National Health Service, undermining it, and bringing in, particularly from America, private firms to look after the patients. And I'm very much against that. I don't think that health should be a commodity that's bought and sold.
Mental illness is not just simply things going wrong inside your brain. Obviously things go inside your brain, but that's not the only way to understand it. They happen in the context of people's lives, their biography, their narrative, or in terms of their social connections, who they are living with. These factors are very important in trying to help somebody when they have a breakdown.
It's a shame to see these people with so much to give and so much to offer and so much going for them end up being in this place, you know, personally, where they don't feel they've got a way out, or they don't feel that they've got a future, or they can't see the end to the struggle that they're going through. So although that's really quite heartbreaking sometimes to see that, it makes it even more rewarding when you see those people recover.
Therefore, it's absolutely critical that you bring into play community factors, community resources, and community support.
We're trying to, at Coultan, trying to destigmatise mental health. We're trying to break that, and through our workshops we do that.
As a psychiatrist, I would love to see a re-examination of some of our approaches to mental health problems. Unfortunately, institutional psychiatry, professional psychiatry is not prepared to do that. It's not just me. There are a number of psychiatrists who have argued that there has to be a significant shift in the way we understand mental health problems and our approach to it, our relationship with people with mental health difficulties. I think until we engage in that discussion and debate about the nature of psychiatric practice, our role within that, and how we can effectively change the current relationship that we have with people with mental health difficulties, our practice will remain reactive and largely unhelpful.
There is a lot of stigma around mental health, distress. There is a lot of stigma. People, they view people differently. If someone, that person is depressed, or they treat them in a different way. I don't want those people to be treated in a different way. I want them to be treated with respect and dignity.
It is a growing field, and it is becoming less and less taboo. But I still think we have a long way to go, and I think that as soon as it becomes more recognised as a genuine, illness, and that these people genuinely need help, and I think that's going to be better not only for the service but for the people, but for the patients that use that service.
During the production of this documentary, contact was made with organizations and charities in the UK to reach patients and families to show their point of view. Unfortunately, due to the sensitivity of the subject, it was not in their interest or power to assist a student production.
There was one very interesting incident. Next door to this experimental place that we were looking at and researching on, there was a neighbour who loved roses, and he had a garden full of roses, and he was very proud of them. Now, one of the patients who'd been settled in the house next door believed that he was Jesus Christ. And one day when the neighbour was out, he went into the neighbour's garden and made himself a crown of thorns from the neighbour's roses. You can imagine what the neighbour felt when he got back and found his roses had all been cut away. So he came in very, very angry. And the situation was explained to him, and he took it very calmly, and he said, yes, I understand now. He wasn't doing anything, he wasn't being malicious, it was just his illness. And he said, you know what, I'm going to ask him into my garden, and I'm going to show him how to prune roses properly. And he did. And the two became friends. So there is that amount of goodwill which is there if you can tap into it.